It's 1:30, so let's call this meeting of the State Government Finance, the Conference Committee for House File 14 to order. Hopefully the Senate will show up at some point. What we are here is this bill was passed from the House and the Senate, and the differences were in it, so we're trying to work out those differences between the House and the Senate bill, but we need to have the Senate here to do that. And I guess I'll start out by calling Secretary Simon to the, we have a guest here, and Mr. Praetz. And as they're coming up, members, just to remind people what we've done so far, we've met before, and the House has made an offer, a couple of offers to the Senate, and they've not accepted either of them. And they were kind of waiting for them to give us an offer, haven't heard back from them. The first offer was to kind of meet halfway between the dollar amounts and go forward from there, and that was turned down. The second one was we offered them the language that they had in their bill and their dollar amount, but a caveat that by the end of session or after the end of session, if nothing is done, it's settled that the Secretary of State will get the remainder of the dollars. And that was voted down by or not supported by the Senate. And so we are here today. We held, the last meeting we held was called by the House, and so the public understands on conference committees, every other day the gavel goes back and forth between the House and the Senate. We called the last meeting and the Senate also didn't show up. So we're here today, and Secretary Simon, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Thanks a lot for having me. I really want to thank everyone for being here and for taking seriously Minnesota's critical need for improved election security. Minnesota has long been a leader in election reform and election integrity. Through smart investments and good ideas about democracy, Minnesota has become a model for other states. I'm proud of our system. I'm proud of the thousands of people, ordinary Minnesotans, who make our elections run, whether that's the county auditor or an election judge or a volunteer polling place worker. We have collectively, as one Minnesota, earned the respect of the country. But all of that is at risk. Our role as a leader is at risk because the security of our election system is at risk. Not because we can't protect ourselves, but because some members of the Senate are choosing to leave our system more vulnerable to attack. Today, Minnesota is the only state in America failing to deploy federal resources to the front lines of this new cyber battlefield. Before I proceed, I just have to note for the record how disappointed I am to see that Senator Kiffmeyer and her Senate colleagues are absent again from this important discussion about election security. Make no mistake, the threat of a hack is a big thing. It is a big deal. It is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of election experts around the country, the #1 threat to the integrity of our election system. Minnesota was unsuccessfully targeted by a foreign government and by foreign hackers in 2016. And it is today the unanimous view of the federal intelligence community that we must prepare for more attacks and from more sources in 2020. We know that our adversaries will be back, and they will be smarter. If Senator Kiffmeyer and her colleagues were here, they wouldn't have to take my word for that. They could hear from one of our nation's most respected elections experts. I'm grateful to the committee today for working with me to invite Noah Praetz here. Until earlier this year, Mr. Praetz served as head of elections for Cook County, Illinois. Now that's significant for at least 3 reasons. First, Cook County is a huge jurisdiction in a huge state. So Mr. Praetz can speak to the complexity and challenges of high-stakes election administration and security. Second, Illinois suffered a serious breach to its election system in 2016 as a result of foreign cyber attack. Mr. Praetz knows what worked, what didn't work, and how to recover. These are critical lessons for the future of election security everywhere, including in Minnesota. Finally, Illinois, which already received its share of HAVA funds at the same time that Minnesota did, has begun spending its federal election security money. So Mr. Praetz can speak knowledgeably today about why these funds are urgent, why they're critical, and what security investments are making the biggest impact. I can tell you personally, I've come to know Mr. Praetz over the last several years as a leader and Executive Committee member of what's called the Government Coordinating Council, the GCC. I sit on that body. It's organized by U.S. intelligence officials for the purpose of working on security improvements to protect our election system from attack. He currently works on election security issues for the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Praetz is appearing before this committee today on his own behalf. I'm pleased and proud that he would give us some of his time today to share his thoughts and his analysis. But before Mr. Praetz gives his testimony, one last word about the efforts of this committee, this conference committee. First, to those senators who are not here again today, you're doing a great disservice to Minnesota. In failing to secure our elections, you are not striking a blow against the House. You are not striking a blow against the Office of Secretary of State or against Democrats. You are striking a blow against the very security of our election system. Finally, I want to thank the members, both Republicans and Democrats, in the Minnesota House for your spirit of collaboration and your spirit of common purpose. This is not a partisan issue anywhere in the country, and it shouldn't be in Minnesota, and it hasn't been in the Minnesota House. And I want to thank Republicans and Democrats for that sincerely. I'm grateful for your willingness to work together in a bipartisan way to meet Minnesota's critical election security needs. Our state and our democracy will be safer for your efforts. Thank you, and with that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Praetz for his analysis.
Well, welcome to the committee, and can you state your name for the tape and then proceed with your testimony?
Yes, sir. Thank you. My name is Noah Praetz. Thank you, Chair, committee members. Thank you, Secretary Simon. It's a real honor to be here in Minnesota, long a model to us in Illinois and nationwide of effective state and local government, especially with respect to elections. I used to live downriver, in fact, in La Crosse and stayed in La Crescent for a time, and it's good to be home. Today, and most days working in elections, I'm reminded that when election officials certify results, they're an essential part of the process that bestows not simply power, but legitimacy. And that legitimacy comes from the essential American belief that our elections reflect a trusted and true accounting of each election. We secure the legitimacy elections by protecting two virtues, truth and trust. And we do so today along two fronts, an infrastructure front and an information front. Truth can be protected with policies and practices that ensure a fair and accurate count. Trust, though, is protected by continuing to deliver election services as expected by voters and candidates, and you do that by investing in and protecting the technology that we rely upon. So I speak to you today in support of efforts to ensure that legitimacy remains the key virtue in our elections and that we work to support it. Specifically, I speak to you about the necessity to secure our elections infrastructure against all adversaries. A little background on me. Recently, I stepped down as Director of Elections in Cook County, Illinois, where I worked for 19 years. During that time, our office tried to lead on technology and security. We used applied forensics in elections. We created a widely circulated cybersecurity checklist in advance of the 2016 elections, but after the hack of our state website. We published the first white paper written by election officials in the wake of the 2016 attacks. I helped the Center for Internet Security adapt their digital security expertise to the unique context of elections, and spent time talking with Harvard's Belfer Center. As co-chair of the Government Coordinating Council, which Secretary Simon's a member of, that the Homeland Security Department created to help address election security, I've been fortunate to work with federal, state, and local leaders in elections, technology, intelligence, and law enforcement. I've had the honor of testifying before the U.S. Senate Rules and Administration Committee, along with Secretary Simon, the House Homeland Security Committee, and the United States Election Assistance Commission. As the Secretary said, I do support the election security initiative inside the Cybersecurity and Election Infrastructure Agency, but today I don't speak on their behalf. I only speak from my time in Cook County. Look, election officials have been securing our nation's votes and voter records for a very long time. They've been securing highly digital networked infrastructure for more than a decade. But the changed environment and the expectation of continued sophisticated attacks forces them to up their game significantly. If the Mueller reports did nothing else, it indisputably underlined the truth we've all come to accept. There are highly capable adversaries who are interested in disrupting the elections institution. And considering that, we all must redouble our efforts to protect elections. Prior to 2000, when I started in the business, election administrators served mostly as logistics managers, kind of like wedding planners, making sure the right list of people came to the right place on the right day. After Bush v. Gore, of course, the Help America Vote Act came to be, and a new era of voting technology was heralded in, and election officials had to become legal compliance and IT managers. They've been working to protect digital technology since. But the 2016 election showed irrefutably that sophisticated attacks are to be expected and that election officials must now become cybersecurity managers. That doesn't mean they need to know all the minutiae of cybersecurity. What it means is they must be aware of the risks and further enabled to allocate resources to manage those risks. Foreign governments, non-state actors, domestic troublemakers each have the capacity and the desire to corrode the essential belief that our election outcomes are true and reliable. To different degrees, this applies both to preliminary results put up on election night and to a lesser degree, official final results. But beyond corrupting election results, the threat reaches the large variety of digital network systems we rely upon to run seamless elections. Things like poll books, election day command centers, mail ballot return systems, informational websites. Therefore, the new security mantra or security framework for election officials should be defend, detect, recover. And though defense is incredibly important and need constant investment, election security isn't simply about defense. Perfect defense is very, very difficult and potentially impossible. I could cite a list of our best companies and government entities that have been breached and damaged despite significant defensive investments. Think about Equifax or Uber, HBO or Sony. This isn't hypothetical, this is real. But instead of just defense, the challenge of election security is to ensure that no attack exceeds our resilience or our ability to detect and recover from attacks, whether that requires restoring lost data or even recounting ballots to establish election results that are trusted and true. Spurred by the need to defend against foreign enemies, federal and state officials have been working successfully to find a good balance of federal involvement in elections without trampling on the authorities states have zealously guarded. Good progress is being made, and hundreds of millions of federal dollars have been invested in nearly all states around the country in recognition of the threat and the need to invest. But more remains to be done nationwide. Even as the community of election officials appreciate that election 2018 was free of any known incidents, they largely recognize those successes are less a function of their efforts, which have been significant, than they are a function of the nation's adversaries' probable choice to hold back. The fundamentals of election security and investments needed to ensure improved security have not changed since the summer of 2016. As election officials, as Americans, we must accept the conclusion of our intelligence community and our law enforcement community that our elections were targeted and are vulnerable. And while enemy hostile probes of our news and influence systems certainly appear to have been more successful in 2016 than those on election administration infrastructure, we expect the attacks will evolve. This is true on the information front and on the infrastructure front. Election administrators must be supported to defend their section of the line, that portion of the infrastructure which they have complete control of. I remember the summer day in 2016 when I started receiving emails from our staff indicating that the Illinois statewide voter database was down. Now, we had a bottom-up system in Illinois, and the impact at the local level wasn't significant. In fact, it wasn't until weeks later that we even learned there'd been a breach to the system, later attributed to foreign adversaries. Little did we know then, though, that we stood at an inflection point in our business. Like Bush, Gore, 2000, the industries and responsibilities have changed forever. Now, I worked for a county and not the state of Illinois, and the breach was of a state system, which is one good reason that a significant amount of the federal HAVA funds are being used in Illinois to shore up the voter database, and in most states. But in 2016, it took weeks for Illinois to recognize they had a vulnerability that was being exploited. It wasn't, in fact, an overly sophisticated attack, and in hindsight, there were probably defenses. But Illinois' election system was targeted, and the bad guys were inside for a while getting data. And Illinois officials believe it wasn't until after the attacks ramped up purposely that they became obvious and they became aware of it. The state took down the system, did investigations with technology professionals and law enforcement, closed the vulnerabilities, notified thousands of impacted voters, and reopened the system that's critical to running confidence-worthy elections in Illinois. At the same time, state and federal security professionals and law enforcement professionals were investigating. And while it's true that almost every online system everywhere is routinely scanned by computers to see if there are weaknesses, like a thief testing doors in an apartment building, it is not the case that foreign adversaries with full units dedicated to the task are looking routinely at every system. These are the adversaries we face, and the ones we failed to adequately defend against in Illinois. I hope no other state or local election official is next, and that's why for 2 years I've been advocating for fast investment of all available resources. Had Illinois been aware at the time of the high probability attack, as election officials everywhere are now aware, they could have acted differently. Of course, they weren't aware then, no election official was. But we all know better now. We all know there are committed adversaries with means and intent who are looking for opportunities to be disruptive to our institution, whether that's through social media and disinformation or the disruption of the various systems relied upon to run elections. We must do what we can to shut down as many of those opportunities as possible by investing in defense. I feel confident that Illinois would have undertaken many of the significant steps your state HAVA working group has recommended taking. They're well within the range of reasonable, in fact, exceptional approaches being taken around the country. Time now is exceedingly more important than working around the edges to achieve agreed notions of perfection. In Illinois, we struggled for a short time debating on the appropriate level of investment and on which projects. Ultimately, however, all agreed that if the federal government invested through the states, failure to invest that money quickly into election security would mean that whoever was responsible for the roadblock would own the future failure. And so debate ensued, it ended quickly, and the state moved forward. While it's true there are a wide variety of behaviors to guard against in elections, each of different consequence and different impact, it is also true that nearly the entire country, and certainly every election official, accepts that our digital systems are vulnerable to advanced persistent threats, and therefore they need investment now. That is why Illinois, like every other state, applied for federal funds aimed at supporting election security efforts, and that is why they put so much of it to use quickly. During debate in Illinois about how to spend the money, I tried to emphasize one message. The federal government is investing $380 million in HAVA funds now to address cyber vulnerabilities, and that money needs to be spent now. That money invested couldn't possibly do everything the states and local election officials need done, and it was possible, maybe even probable, that some of those investments might be in areas that in hindsight proved wrong. But even the imperfect allocation of finite resources today is far superior to holding and squirreling away resources for some event in the future, particularly in the case of known adversaries. That argument ultimately won out and investment flowed quickly in the state. Each actor ultimately recognized that if they held the federal funds and something bad happened on the election security front, the accountable party would be clear. In Illinois, we received $14 million. Our legislature and executive of different parties moved quickly to make those funds available to the state election officials. And that was no small accomplishment in Illinois, where years were spent in gridlocked, and there was a supercharged campaign for the executive. And when it came to the conclusions of the intelligence community and the universally accepted importance of elections, nothing was going to get in the way of shoring up the infrastructure. I believe there was a great demonstration of professional governance, nonpartisanship, and apolitical leadership on this issue in Illinois. Early on in the state, we formed a group consisting of representatives of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Illinois State Police and their cyber team, the Illinois Information Security Office, the leadership of the local election official associations, and the State Board of Elections. That governance group meets regularly to this day. But back then, we all recognized it was important for the state to keep some money to fortify the system that had been breached. Now, we don't want to fight the last battle over again, but we better not lose the last battle all over again. The State Board had to shore up the most direct access point for foreign adversaries. Those specific additional defenses were left to cyber and database experts inside the state, and they followed recommendation from numerous places, including Homeland Security and the Government Coordinating Council. Good guidance and perfect direction is not the critical path issue today. There are a wide variety of plausible and responsible approaches to securing infrastructure. The critical path issue today is the availability of resources and the time necessary to operationalize the recommendations once the resources are flowing. As well as investing in the statewide voter database, Illinois invested in people to support their locals. The Government Coordinating Council issued guidance suggesting cyber navigators. Our legislature mandated that half of the HAVA funds just released be expended on a cyber navigator program. Our state board partnered with the executive branch through the governor's office to help utilize state information security expertise and resources in fulfilling this mandate. No governance issues arose in building a support apparatus that supports elections in Illinois. These navigators were put to work in Illinois to accomplish three vital goals. First, they worked to institute the election security framework of defend, detect, recover, helping improve defenses within elections offices and supporting efforts to institute auditing and detection techniques and recovery plans. Second, the navigators are helping do the work necessary to secure free support being offered by public and private organizations like the Department of Homeland Security, the state of Illinois, Google, Microsoft, and Cloudflare, and the Elections Information Sharing and Analysis Center. They're also working with the election vendors who provide much of the elections infrastructure and support to local election officials. These vital efforts can be accomplished here as they are nationwide. I suggested to Congress a year ago that the investments needed to be made as soon as possible. I told them then that it would require the states to cut through any red tape that can delay action. After all, the danger is not hypothetical. We're bracing against renewed attacks we've been told to expect. Voters should feel confident that we have resilient election systems in America. Some states better positioned than others, and you guys actually in a very good policy place, with paper ballots and good audits everywhere. But voters should also understand that without continued investment in people and products, the possibility of successful attack increases. One job of an election administrator, maybe the top job, is to conduct elections so that losing candidates accept the fact that they lost fairly. Anything that hinders their ability to do that decreases confidence in the system and undermines their ability to bestow legitimacy, not just victory. Election officials deploy a wide variety of networked, connected digital services. Each of these is a ripe target for our adversaries. A successful attack against any of those services may not change a single vote, but could still damage public confidence. And this is true in a time of great public suspicion. Some losing candidates are already apt to call their defeats into doubt. A new digital breach, no matter how far removed from the vote counting system, could turn sore losers to cynicism, disbelief, potentially revolt. And that's the reaction the adversaries of the United States want. In fact, in the face of direct targeting by advanced persistent threats of a state or local election office, it's very possible that there will be service disruptions, most likely to things like websites. The bottom line is we cannot eliminate every chance of breach, but we can make sure that successful attacks are rare, and we can provide assurances that we are prepared to recover quickly when they happen. Democracy is not perfect. As Churchill says, it's the worst form of government, except for the others. We need to protect it. We will regret it if our democracy is damaged because we looked away at a critical moment. This is what I told the United States Congress and the Illinois legislature, what I submit to you today. Thank you for the opportunity to appear, and I look forward to any questions.
Well, thank you. And Judge, just want to point out, we have 4 senators who have joined us. They're not on the committee, but thank you for the interest. And if you have some questions, we'll allow you into the questioning also out of courtesy. Mr. Praetz.
Yes, sir.
Now, does Illinois, and Minnesota is one of, I was told 5 states that we have to approve federal dollars when we get them. Does Illinois, isn't that one of those 5, or is the state able to spend that money, the Secretary of State, and Illinois is able to spend that money without legislative approval?
Sure. Well, there did have to be an allocation in order for money to be expended. So our state did accept the money, and our legislature and governor acted to accept it and push it out to the State Board of Elections.
Thank you. In your opinion, I mean, can you comment on what happened in Illinois and maybe in Cook County, you have more understanding of it, but what happened in Illinois and what could happen here? I mean, what is the worst case scenario that could happen here that could basically blow up our election?
We rely on digital services for everything. The more network connected they are, the more available they are to bad guys sitting across the country or across the world who have very low risk. So the most likely environment is a continued, in my opinion, is a continued push on the information front, continuing to use the foreign influence inside of the social media, and we've obviously got to be prepared to contextualize that. But election officials do not have a lot of control in that area. Election officials have plenary control over the infrastructure, so the systems we rely upon to run elections. The more public-facing they are, websites are the more likely attack vectors. But if you were to ask the Iranians how staying off the internet works, I think they would tell you that somehow they were successful. Their nuclear system was taken down, even though they never touched the internet. So there are capabilities from committed foes to do significant work. Now, that's on the extreme of highly unlikely, but possible. Those are the type of things you build audits in to ensure that you catch, policies that build resiliency so that in the event that a critical software system is offline, you can continue to deliver results that are trusted and true. But the more highly likely systems are those internet-facing websites.
Members' questions. Representative Dehn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Praetz. Thank you for being here. Myself, along with lots of other people, are concerned about 2020 and what's going to happen. And do you think that Minnesota and other states should expect more aggressive attempts in 2020? Sort of first part. And then a second part, do you think that us not having access to these funds might put us at a greater security risk in the 2020 election?
Sure. Mr. Praetz.
So in 2 parts, the first one is I think the responsible posture of any risk manager, certainly any chief executive of a state in terms of the elections apparatus and local election officials, they have no choice but to expect attacks that are more sophisticated than the ones that were there, given that the information we've gotten, it is simply the expectation that we have to operate under. So therefore, holding, as we manage risk and think about the different probabilities of different occurrences, your operational risks of just putting on an election, given that expectation, the responsible answer is to invest available resources in systems to make them less likely to be breached. And so nationwide, there is absolutely an increased risk of system failure, or of defensive breaches, of service disruptions without investment. And you'll find local and state election officials petitioning their state governments, as well as the federal government and their local government for investments. And that's true here as well.
Representative Dehn.
So thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Praetz. So when I think about what's happening in Minnesota, And when I think about the work that the Secretary of State's done at putting together the working group and putting forward what are those things that are going to be critical moving forward as far as outlining how that money is used, do you know if that's a requirement of the federal dollars, or have we already gone beyond what the sort of requirements are from the federal government relative to using these funds for our election security?
So in Illinois, we did not engage in that process. To apply for the funds with the Election Assistance Commission, we had to put forward some documentation, expected expenditures. Our state did that, but we did not create a committee to work collaboratively prior to doing that. So I don't believe it's any requirement.
Representative Dehn.
Mr. Chair, thank you. And this might actually be a question for Secretary Simon. So I've been thinking a lot about what we've been doing or not doing here in the past several weeks on this conference committee. And I'm thinking about a recount we had in our state several years ago, and the resources were used in that recount to take place. We're one of the states that do a paper backup on every vote, and I'm just going to throw something out there if you could even fathom what this might cost the state. So if our total system was taken down after or in the process of people voting and counting the votes, and we had to go to a hand count for every election throughout the state of Minnesota, not just the statewide, but local county, local city elections, what might the cost of something like that be to Minnesota taxpayers?
Secretary Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Dehn, that is the mother of all fiscal notes. I don't know, I can't tell you offhand. It would be very costly, not only in money, but in time, in hassle, in human capital. That would be an extraordinary situation for all contests to have that sort of hand count. Looks like Mr. Praetz, do you have something to add to that? Okay. I thought, well, you might know. So that would be very difficult. And we just don't want to risk it. Here we are. I just need to put a fine point on it since they have a microphone. It isn't just, we were the only state that hasn't, not only are we the only state that doesn't have the money, we're the only state to have not had the money well into last year. So this is, and there's no explanation for it. We just don't yet even have an explanation for why it's taking this long. It shouldn't take this long. It's not a partisan issue, even here in Minnesota, based on the vote and the support in the House by Democrats and Republicans. But we literally don't even have an explanation, not even a cover story for why the delay. And that's the most disappointing thing.
Senator Rest, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. I have three questions. One, I'm curious about comparing the sophistication of Minnesota's system with that of Illinois', and I wonder how sophisticated, how recent, how new is Illinois' voting equipment. And then secondly, in your testimony, you mentioned in Minnesota, there we have a paper trail. We have paper ballots that support the our election system. And could you comment on those two issues to start with? And then, Mr. Chairman, I have one follow-up.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the question. Unfortunately, without the sort of technical specifications, I haven't done a deep dive into the different platforms that the statewide systems are built on. So I'm unable to offer any valuable sort of response to the first part of the question.
Mr. Chairman, sir, in your estimation.
Senator, there's a call of the House, so we have to go back upstairs and vote, so we'll take a short recess here.
Okay.